Brian does not need that much introduction, but those of you who might not know as much about him. Brian is a professor of social and political change, director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at UWI, and recently university director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Economic and Social Studies. He has taught political theory, comparative politics, Caribbean political thought, and African American politics at several universities in the United States, Suriname, the West Indies. He has held several positions as visiting fellow at the Center of Latin American Studies at Cambridge University, visiting thinker scholar at Stanford University, and visiting scholar at Brown University. He has authored numerous books, hundreds of articles perhaps, on Caribbean politics and political theory, and I'm sure you're aware of some of them. Among these are Caribbean revolutions and revolutionary theory, an assessment of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Grenada, 1993 and 2001. Narratives of Resistance, Jamaica, Trinidad, and the Caribbean in 2000, with Norman Gervin, who is here with us. The Thought of the New World, the Quest for Decolonization in 2010. And some of you might not know this, but Brian is also a novelist. He has written Paint Tongue Red, which was published in 2003. So he travels both academia and the world of art. You will gather from these book examples and that beyond Jamaican politics and popular culture, Brian specializes in theories of revolution, democracy and the state, comparative Caribbean politics, and Caribbean thinkers and political thought. He's a commentator on Jamaican and Caribbean politics and is quoted occasionally in regional and international newspapers and magazines. One of the things I learned in reading Brian's CV that before he was an academic, he was a television man at the Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation, and a different trajectory might have taken him to be an anchor in CNN Today. I don't know if that is why he is the public orator at UWI since 2006. And a couple of his current sort of projects include the 50-50 project, looking at the whole issue of independence in Jamaica and the Caribbean. He's preparing a volume and a film on this currently. And of course, Brian is one of the co-organizers, co-founders of this entire Westminster in the Caribbean project. So with no more ado, I introduce you to, and ask Brian to come to the podium. Brian.
Thank you, Dylan. You must remind me to shorten that resume. Next time I send it to you. I want to begin by thanking Kate and Dylan and the team at UCL, particularly the elusive Oscar, who all of us who came here would have met online for a stellar event. I think they've done a really good job, and I look forward to seeing many of you at the continuation of the conversation next year, September, perhaps this time in Kingston, where we've just decided that we're going to try to shift the focus for the second round of this conversation to Caribbean, to futures, precisely the sort of area I'm trying to open up in the discussion this afternoon. So we're going to not obviously eliminate any discussion about the history of Westminster, but we're going to just tilt it a little bit in favor of where do we go in the next 10 years. So watch this space. We'll be working on the second part of this, what I think is a very important event. These 2 days were what I think were full of rich and extraordinary information and discussion, and it reminds me of the strength of an event which focuses in one plenary. I've been to too many conferences in which there are 5, 10 panels going on, and you always miss the important stuff. But when you have one plenary, we end up on the same page for the entire conference, and much richer for it. And I'm really happy that we were able to do that. I'm searching for a cricket metaphor to describe my role here this evening. Along the lines of coming into bat after so many star players have piled on the runs, I can bat freely without worry of letting down the side because multiple centuries are already on the board. But then the obvious corollary struck me that I'm so far down in the order, indeed, I'm a tail ender. Nothing much can be expected of me. But even Courtney Walsh, my classic embodiment of the debonair tail ender, has been known to hit the ball hard, and on the rare occasion when he did in fact connect, actually put some runs on the board. So that's my metaphoric interlude. Let me bring it to a rapid end. Proceed with my ruminations as tail ender. Indeed, night watcher. The entire tenor of this conference was brilliantly set up by the first two papers yesterday morning. Norman Gervin's opening keynote was sharply critical of Westminster practice, focusing on its democratic deficit and arguing eloquently that it had contributed in no small measure to a crisis verging on the existential in the Anglo-Caribbean region. Paul Sutton, on the other hand, the second paper, in apparent contradiction to Norman's thrust, proposed that despite the need for sweeping reform, and Paul very clearly accepts this, liberal democracy is in reasonably good health, and the Westminster variants practiced in the Caribbean have proved in general to be, to quote Paul, robust, reliable, and resilient. It was precisely at this moment that I took the decision to tear up the paper and go back to the drawing board in order to try to address this obvious tension between the two positions. And the tension stayed with me all last night, in which I did not sleep. Rewrote the paper, and only at the end of this presentation will the tension hopefully have gone. My conclusion, after a lot of thought, was interestingly that both Norman and Paul are right, though with multiple caveats. Norman is absolutely right in that there is a multi-pronged crisis facing the small territories of the Caribbean, underwritten by a profound crisis of will and direction coming from the political leaders. And I think he's also right that the main contributor to the stasis and rudderlessness of the present moment is to be located in the nature of the Westminster political system. Yet Paul's assessment of the success of Caribbean Westminster, if you will, cannot be faulted in the sense that, for the most part, the system of first past the post elections, with generally stable parliamentary majorities, avoided instability prevalent in many other post-colonial states, and encouraged peaceful succession. Peaceful succession is, I think, from a Caribbean perspective, an undervalued feature. But if we think of the alternatives, even the Caribbean alternatives, the long night of Burnhamite paramounts in Guyana, or the failure of the PRG in Grenada to find its way quickly back to electoral forms after March 13, both in the party and in the state, which laid the foundations for the crisis of 1983 and left the military as the only option to solve a peculiar crisis of succession, then we can appreciate this better. One can also reflect on Michael Manley's decision in October 1980 to concede defeat to Edward Seaga after a long and bitter campaign, generally described as verging on a civil war. There were many in the PNP and around it, including myself as a young militant, who were not at all sure that this was the right thing to do. Yet if Manley had chosen to go the other way, that is to contest the legitimacy of the outcome, the options for the future of Jamaica would undoubtedly have been far more tragic and bleak than they are today. So on the one hand, Westminster has provided a framework for succession and stable government in the Caribbean, as Jorge Dominguez noted 2 decades ago. But on the other, it has contributed exponentially to this moment of stasis, indeed crisis, so vividly sketched yesterday. Forgive me as I develop my argument through a series of phases, some of which have already been traced by Norman and others. But it is difficult to cut to the proverbial chase without some prior minimal sketches. Last year, my institute, Legacies, hosted the 50-50 conference, at which some here were present. It held up a mirror that looked at the Caribbean independence experience with special focus on the first two territories to make the break, Jamaica on August 6, 1962, and Trinidad and Tobago at the very end of the same month. It certainly forced me and all present to come to terms with the contradictory realities of Jamaica in independence. On the one hand, the history of almost endemic violence, the absence of any serious economic growth over 3 of those 5 decades, the failure of society to address some of the basic foundations of contemporary human rights, the treatment of women, children, the poorest, the proliferation of homophobia are all undoubted features, each shameful and substantial dimensions of our post-colonial experience. Yet, inevitably, these have to be juxtaposed, as Norman suggested yesterday, with the glory of the London Olympics and the absolute delight that Jamaicans at home and abroad from all walks of life took in the Jamaican team's triumphant march through the world of track and field. More on this anon, as I want to suggest that in the success of track and field is a template for Jamaican and Caribbean success in the 21st century. I recall also the mass crowd of people, more than 30,000 strong, gathered in the National Stadium in Kingston. As a small boy, I remember a similar sized crowd some 50 years before in that very place. There was a palpable sense of belonging both then and more recently. If even fleetingly and through the pall of 50, in many respects, benighted years, I certainly felt the glimmer of the possibility that there is still a Jamaican national project. This feeling was reinforced some months later when I was guest speaker at the launch of a film in Guadeloupe in November 2012 on Jamaican independence, captured in the wonder the young Guadeloupean filmmakers and their audience showed in their appreciation of Jamaican independence. Despite their wonderful roads and in many respects EU standard infrastructure and access to healthcare and education, the sense that something was missing in their totality was evident, captured in the statement one young woman blurted out to me in a dinner following the documentary. She said in impeccable French-inflected English, "I am not French." So one of the questions I wish to put on the table, intimated again by Norman yesterday for discussion, is, can we identify a Jamaican project worth fighting for? I want to begin to attempt to answer that question by linking to the theme of this conference and thinking back to the origins of the Jamaican Constitution, Ordering Council 1962. Trevor Monroe argued in his important study of the making of the Jamaican Independence Constitution that there was almost no consultation. It was a product of the concurrence of opinions between Jamaican elites and Whitehall. In a key discussion, he questioned whether it could be considered autochthonous, that is, a natural organic development of the society. He concluded somewhat enigmatically that it was difficult to describe it as not autochthonous, as autochthony also implied the inherited and 3 centuries old British traditions of Westminster, common law, etc., which were as Jamaican as could be. In the main, I think Trevor was right both on the autochthony question and in his assessment of the absence of consultation in the process and the dominance of elite perspectives, that is the democracy question. Yet I wish to nuance his argument somewhat to suggest that in many respects the Constitution was a product of a peculiar correlation of social forces in Jamaica and satisfied in large measure not just the interests of the elites, but provided protections for the interests of the poor in the entrenching of the 2-party political system. The famous inclusion of the protection of property clause, which was discussed yesterday, is perhaps the most evident feature of the intervention of the propertied classes to protect their interests. And this is undoubtedly exactly what it was. However, there is a danger of reading the history of the 50s and 60s from the perspective of the present if we don't appreciate that the entrenching of the 2-party system in the provision for one leader of the opposition, the Senate appointed by only 2 parties, the extensive role of the leader of the opposition in various clauses, was on the one hand an entrenchment of the power of the 2 leaders, but simultaneously was also the entrenching of the universal adult suffrage system, which along with the right to organize have been the main fruits of the 1938 uprising. Thus, if we approach 1962 from the perspective of the parlous state of the country today, the general unpleasant odor surrounding all politicians, and the widespread disappointment in politics, we may fail to see the optimism and sense of the possible that still existed at that time. More so, we miss the picture if we don't recall that the victory of universal adult suffrage presented a frightening moment for the oligarchy, who in the Jamaica Democratic Party tried to contest on their own and were trounced. Their resulting move, quite appropriately, was to seek shelter in the Jamaica Labour Party, the more receptive of the two parties, and with the more adventurous and far-sighted members of the oligarchy, eventually supporting the People's National Party as well, though in its post-socialist phase after the eviction of the 4 H's in 1951. In summary, my argument is that the Constitution was far more a reflection of a social understanding, what I could call elsewhere the Pact of 1944, than an elitist coup brought in as a thief in the night entirely against the wishes of the poor. What was the social foundation of this pact? There was, I suggest, a loose middle and working class alliance built around, on the one hand, teachers, civil servants, and the rural better off peasantry, and on the other, the agricultural, urban, and critically burgeoning bauxite and alumina workers. This pact was also evident in the trade union party alliance. It provided, as I've suggested before, for the effective circulation of elites, satisfying the ambitions of the growing professional classes. But it also led to dramatically improved protection and avenues for mobility for the poor, as Richard Drayton intimated yesterday, partially satisfying some of the worst failures of the colonial period, particularly in public health and education. Yet, the practice of Westminster in Jamaica since then is fraught with typical features that have led, in retrospect, almost inevitably to the Dodos crisis of 2010, which was also discussed in great detail yesterday. Let us review some of these features. First of all, a particularly sharp contestation for power. And I think we need to go back to the nature of the two-party system in Jamaica and how it was formed. Because when Bustamante was in jail, Norman Manley was looking after the interests of his union, the appropriately titled Bustamante Industrial. The only trade union named after an individual in the Western world. The expectation was on Buster's release that he would take over the union, Manley would lead the party, the PNP, of which Buster was a part. And Buster left prison and broke with the PNP and formed his own party. There, of course, there's a tremendous body of work, and I imagine that the migrated files, Norman, may tell us something about the discussions that took place between Bustamante and perhaps the governor as to why, when his release from jail would not lead him to returning to the PNP. But the result is that this decision, of course, which Buster had every right to take as a now free individual, but he had been detained during some of the war years because he was considered as, like others in Jamaica, as a threat to British national security. But the point I want to get to is from the perspective of the People's National Party. Buster was considered a traitor. And there are PNP people still alive today who consider this act an act of calumny. And the beginning of the political party system in Jamaica is not passed as two parties with different positions who shake their hands and who consider, well, let's go about trying to win an election. But it is ridden with deep and sharp divisions, leading very early to the emergence, particularly among the trade unionized workers who supported the two parties, of deep quasi-tribal loyalties. The emergence of the garrison phenomenon follows, not inevitably, but certainly reasonably naturally from this foundation. And if we want to trace if we want to move forward 2 decades to the real cementing of the garrison phenomenon, it is when Edward Seaga attempts to build an electoral enclave, Tivoli Gardens, again interestingly named, in what had been hard-won People's National Party territory. And so we need to understand a little history here to understand cut and thrust, that West Kingston had been Bustamante's seat, the leader of the Jamaica Labour Party. The People's National Party, particularly its left wing, had worked assiduously to undermine Buster's influence to the point where Buster had to leave that seat and go to a country seat in order for him to survive. And then in 1962, the JLP win the elections, and Seaga uses this as an opportunity to bulldoze out the PNP supporters in what was a slum, and to build an enclave in an area which was largely PNP, which became a fortified enclave, and which is the beginning of a process which is still perhaps unfolding even today in Jamaica. So we have the emergence of the garrison phenomenon, and thirdly, we have the application of winner-takes-all Westminster principles in a context of intense urban and rural poverty, leading in lockstep fashion to economic disaster. Now, I want to spend a little time exploring how the system works, or how the system has worked. And some of this has come out in our discussion, but forgive me, in a little model construction. Let us take a government entering office in year 1. And we're thinking now about models, so forgive generalities. Year 1, the government takes power with a program and a set of reasonable objectives associated with growth, development, etc. Maybe elaborated under the influence of Norman Gervin or W. Arthur Lewis or somebody appropriately. These are reasonable objectives. However, on taking power, there are immediate demands from the strongest supporters at the grassroots level for a reorganization of, for instance, the housing stock. So the first order of government is to satisfy these demands. And of course, no new houses have been built. So not initially by expanding stock are these demands satisfied, but by a process of physical transference of stock from people who lived in those houses before, who are then put on the road to satisfy the party supporters who are now brought in to take their place. There's also, and this is an important point which hasn't come out in this discussion sufficiently, even though there's discussion of clientelism, mentions middle class clients. Is they down here? Yes. Yeah, they're middle class clients. But we're talking here now about wealthy clients. And Carl Stone develops this point at length. These are the financial backers of the party who call in their chips after the elections for a variety of demands, from concessionary duties, typically on the import of their goods, to tax benefits and other special privilege, some corporate, others personal, as simple as perhaps reducing the duty on a Audi Q5 or Mercedes-Benz or whatever. Together, these demands from below and above serve in a pincer fashion to disrupt any coherence of broad developmental goals. But there's another reinforcing feature in that the new government typically seeks to reinvent the wheel. Thus, policies of the former government are abandoned wholesale without sufficient attention to merit or worth. Recall we're model building here, so generalizations. The end result is that by year 2, there's an incoherence to government policy that follows the government throughout its tenure. Tax revenues have been compromised by concessions. New programs, as they get off the ground, require new funding, therefore, and government typically engages in the absence of buoyant internal revenues in borrowing, either externally or locally by the sale of paper, leading to the accumulation of government debt. By year 3, elections begin to loom large. The imperative is now no longer on long-term strategic planning, if it ever was, but on short-term electoral goals. The result, eminently captured in a famous statement by a former Minister of Finance of the People's National Party, is to, quote, run with it, unquote. That is, release liquidity in the system for a variety of loosely defined slush funds, including road contracts, works, etc., that satisfy immediate demands, but undermine any notion of long-term development, serve to further accumulate debt, encourage inflationary tendencies, intensify partisan hostilities, and lay the foundation for the new government, whether incumbent or from the former opposition, starting over the sordid process. Only this time, from a lower position in the downward spiral of debt, tribalism, and policy failure. In outlining this model, I don't want to trivialize the critical phases in post-colonial Jamaican history. The tremendous demands of the urban poor and their strategic placement, which led to the popular movement for better living conditions and an end to the color bias in society and greater inclusiveness in politics in the 1970s. I don't want to gloss over either the determined elitist and foreign resistance which led to the near civil war conditions of 1980, nor to simplify the significance of the JLP victory in 1980, which led to a new phase as the armed gangs became posses, and the garrison phenomenon, already entrenched, attained eventually an unimaginable autonomy, unimaginable from the position of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, from the traditional parties. By the beginning of the 21st century then, all the features of the present moment are well in place. One, lack of growth for 20 years. Absence of a long-term planning mechanism due to the things we have discussed embedded in the winner-take-all phenomenon. Violence as a deep discouragement to investment and leading to the export of capital and massive and sustained migration. 80% of Jamaica's tertiary trained people, as I think has been mentioned before, live overseas. Every year I sit on the stage at graduation, or for the past 4 or 5 years as public orator, and watch hundreds of doctors crossing the stage, in the full knowledge that if 30 of those doctors remain, we are lucky. If one crop of doctors graduating in 1 year from the University of Westminster were to stay in Jamaica, all of them, a significant part of our medical problems would be solved in that one crop. But that is not the case for reasons we've just suggested. And of course, the growth of embryonic states within a state, best exemplified, though not unique, in the Tivoli Gardens super garrison. And along with this, an overarching and popular cynicism towards politics and towards social life in general. The social basis of what is happening here, aside from the massive migration of the middle and skilled working classes, we have a decline of trade unionism because the traditional industrial sector is in a deep slide in the era of neoliberalism. We have some serious things happening at the level of the family, which need to be discussed separately. And I just mentioned the reality of the Barry phenomenon, which many people here will understand, which is to say that you have either one or both members of the family leaving children behind. The best case scenario is when the child is left behind with an aunt or a grandmother. The worst case scenario is when the child is left behind with a neighbor. And the only integument between that child and the neighbor is the money sent by the parent once every month or once every period. And the result is the serious undermining of social fabric. And there are a number of imbricated features due to the bauxite aluminum collapse, decades of structural adjustment, immigration, but also the crippling of sectors of the local bourgeoisie, the decline of manufacturing, a hotel sector supported by state subsidies, and the emergence of a high interest rate environment leading to a paper bourgeoisie, people who make their wealth, which is a fact of unique and stretch of imagination to Jamaica, for having gotten in on the possession of paper early in the game, and therefore having built wealth around high interest rates. And anybody who understands how that works in a place like Jamaica will know that many people have become multi-millionaires, starting with relatively small sums because of interest rates which particularly in the 90s galloped out of all proportion. In summary, the notion that Jamaica's economic situation is tied purely to its structural location is only at best partially true. The reality is that other states with even less resources have managed to experience growth, the forging of linkages, and the dynamism we associate with various notions of economic development via either authoritarian regimes forcing through long-term arrangements that lead to sometimes even greater equity, investment and growth, as Singapore or Korean model, or secondly, the forging of social and political arrangements via consultation, bargaining that allows for more long-term decisions to be taken. Barbados, with multiple caveats, Mauritius. The result in Jamaica is that fierce competitiveness enhanced by the Westminster system led almost to civil war, the breakdown of the social pact of 1944, and a moment of what I have described elsewhere as hegemonic dissolution, or simply the failure of any social bloc to decisively put its stamp on the situation, with the result being a rudderless, drifting moment, providing fertile ground for corruption, violence, and anarchy. This is what we've called yesterday and today the Dudus moment and beyond. For anybody not familiar, Dudus is Coke, who is the formidable figure that Norman described yesterday, president of Tivoli Gardens, and who was called up for charges in the United States, and the US DEA wanted to extradite him, and the Jamaican government initially hesitated and sought, in fact, to put it simply, to bamboozle the United States, because they feared that he was so important to their political survival that they couldn't afford to give him up. The result was a very interesting process, which was a growing popular revulsion to the entire Dulles events, which essentially was this linkage between the government and the Don, the Don of Dons, and which raised critical questions about democracy and sovereignty in Jamaica. But I would also suggest that the revulsion expressed in a certain kind of popular mobilization, which we can come back to, opened up new possibilities resulting from the social coalition that had demanded an end to the government party Tivoli Garrison marriage. What the resignation of Bruce Golding in the winter, if you wish, of 2011, and the subsequent electoral defeat of the Jamaica Labour Party in Christmas of that year suggested was the emergence of an embryonic alliance out of the growth of new middle-class-led environmentalist rights groupings, the mobilization of elements from the reduced but traditional working classes, and elements of the business elite that weren't willing to put up with further with this relationship any longer. Interestingly, in a peculiar twist, none of this would have been possible without the United States pressure. So we have this peculiar alliance with the United States acting on a matter which significant sections of the Jamaican people wanted to happen, but which could not happen without or was unlikely to happen without the push from the United States occurring, a concurrence of interests, if you wish. But this sort of alliance, which allowed for the removal of Golding and led to the triumph of the People's National Party in 2011, remains tentative and fraught. What occurred was a stalling of the momentum of the Garrison phenomenon rather than its decapitation. What we had was a popular coalition against business as usual, against the pointlessness of the clientist-led party competition system, but without any resolution which was decisive. The new PNP government came into power with Portia Simpson Miller at its head in January of 2012, and I want to suggest that the PNP has, over the past 2 years, largely squandered the goodwill that it had. I think it misinterpreted the electoral victory of 2011 as a victory for its party's policies. It wasn't a victory for its party's policies, but it was a victory against the events, the sordid events that had preceded it. And the IMF agreement, which the government has spent more or less the last year putting in place, is more a reflection of a sad reality engendered by years of Westminster enhanced competition. And there's an instance of the present instance, which I think best illustrates the problem with this government, of the Chinese wanting to build a shipping facility in the most delicate ecological place on the south coast of Jamaica. And the Chinese have said that this is where they want to build it. And this may sound familiar to a lot of people. And of course, they want to bring they claim they're going to bring 1.5 billion US dollars into the mix to do it. And of course, in a country like Jamaica, in its present state, this is like a serious question that we have to consider very carefully, quite obviously. 20,000 jobs potentially in the building of the port, another 10,000 jobs permanently beyond the port being built. This is serious business. However, the government has failed so far, and I suggest that this is still very much a project in the making, so we'll see where they go from there. So far they have failed to forge effective cross-party debates around this issue. They've avoided the sort of close work with interest groups to discuss the pros and cons with the environmental people, with the fishermen from Old Harbour. So what we see within the parties is ministers jockeying for positions in relation to the potential post-Simpson era and their place in that leadership. So I must say that there is not much that is optimistic in the present moment, and which carries me on to the substance of my talk, which is what therefore of the future. Forgive me if I begin by restating the specific ways in which the present constitution hindered national development. Winner takes all leads to the exclusion and alienation of the losers. Everybody in this conference has said that, so I'm repeating a general conclusion of this conference. It also leads to the absence of long-term consensus, as Dylan suggested in his talk earlier on. There are limited checks on the power of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, as almost everyone has proposed. Implicitly, there is a failure to address corruption. There's often the adequate entrenchment of rights. And in the context of a now highly informed population, their involvement is woefully inadequate. Therefore, I would suggest, and what I'm going to try to do here, is suggest an agenda. And then we can discuss whether or not there's any way to get there. But let's put the agenda on the table first. The agenda must include ways to achieve long-term consensus. I think there's no development in future for the Caribbean that cannot put in place long-term projects, long-term planning, which involves a long-term consensus. It also involves the undermining of the winner-take-all notion, because it has been one of the most damaging features of the history of the past 50 years. There needs to be greater control over the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. There need to be firmer institutional checks on corruption. The greater entrenchment of rights, and finally, greater access of people to the political space, to both information and decision making. For those of you who follow me carefully, and because I don't have a nice PowerPoint up, I have simply stated from the basis of what are the problems, what I think the solutions need to be. If I were to suggest an ideal set of requirements based on these weaknesses and what we need to do, I would argue that first, in relation to long-term consensus, we need to find our way to the discussion and ratification of long-term, cross-party, programmatic goals that are taken out of the cycle of party politics, except perhaps from institutional midterm reviews. There's no reason why the policy framework surrounding, for example, as has been discussed here, environmental and climate policy, perhaps health, education, public debt and security cannot be taken out and by a process of consultation established as areas which have a 10, 15 or even 20-year agenda attached to them with regular reviews. That I think is certainly one way that we could approach this. One thing about instances of coalition government, well, that is a debatable question and we can talk about it. But I'm not suggesting coalition government here, but I'm suggesting that the public has got to recognize that, for example, educational policy is not a football that is changed every time the government changes. Cannot work. Similarly, security policy, perhaps most importantly, environmental policy, as Storm suggested earlier on. Secondly, we need to undermine the winner-takes-all approach by removing the critical elements, either through a separation of parliamentarians from cabinet in a quasi-presidential form. This is the 1991 Stone Report form. But there are dangers here, and we have to talk about them frankly. The dangers are gridlock, as President Obama is experiencing on a daily basis. And this is a real danger. If you're looking at a country which has to be nimble on its feet and make short-term decisions and learn how to steer the ball into the goal, then you cannot have gridlock. So there's a real problem with the presidential system, which it may solve the problem of our prime minister, but I would suggest that we have to look at it very, very carefully, and I'm not proposing it here today. Worse yet, if we have a presidential system and both the Congress and the president are in the hands of the same party, then we might have a super prime minister on our hands who is even more intrusive than the character we have grown to recognize over the years. So we have to be very, very careful before we jump into this. So I'm not supportive of the presidential approach for the reasons I've just mentioned. Or alternatively, a parliamentary system, but as the 2002 Barbados conference, the OAS conference suggested, with proportional representation either for the upper house or a fraction of seats in the lower house, or single house as the case may be in other jurisdictions with the seats divided in different amounts. And the single member list system was put on the table today, which is another area for discussion. Now, we can discuss all of these formulas, and all of them have their pros and cons, including the point Harshal made yesterday about New Zealand, that none of them are panaceas that solve all the problems that we face. But in the particular condition of particular places, they may work to ameliorate some of these problems. And I obviously can't go into all of them in great detail today, except to suggest that any system that can smooth the edges of the absolute power of the Prime Minister is one that we will consider very carefully, because we know that beast. I think we know he's too dangerous for us to continue in the old way with him. I suggest that whichever one of these combinations is suitable. I'm not suggesting there's a one-size-fits-all model. The model for the smallest islands of the Eastern Caribbean might not be the same as a Jamaican model or elsewhere. But I'm suggesting that either way, we need to look at the St. Vincent proposal of diasporic members, the one that came up in the early radical phase of the constitutional debate. Because whatever system is in place, we can no longer afford not to have the diaspora represented in government, broadly defined, of the Caribbean. And perhaps minority diaspora members, appointed, elected, I would support elected, but how you do that is something which we can exercise our minds around. Greater control over the Prime Minister and Cabinet. That was my third point. I returned to Stone in 1991, who proposed recall of MPs who failed to perform well. The recall question has fallen off a lot of agendas, including my good friend Selwyn Rand's agenda in his earlier book, Winner Takes All. I quote Stone, "Giving the voters the right to recall MPs would have a major impact in restoring to the public a sense that they as voters have control over the politician. To give voters the right to recall non-performing MPs would send a serious signal to politicians, motivating them to take their duties and responsibilities more seriously." Unquote. If this applies also to the Prime Minister as a sitting member of Parliament, if it is thought through carefully to avoid frivolous attempts at removal, of course the opposition will always have an interest to recall immediately that an election is over, then instituting recall with the necessary safeguards would be a major step in redressing the balance of power between politicians and the popular will. Firmer institutional checks. Okay, I have something written in the column here because while everybody was talking, I was writing. So I'll just mention that. I want to propose, alongside the measures which hem in the Prime Minister and his ministers, specific instances of direct consultation. I think out of the detritus of the Grenada Revolution, the budget debates needs to be rescued. And we have the basis to do that even better now with the invention of crowdsourcing, with the existence of every West Indian person having a cell phone. A certain set of critical consultations and even referendum can now be reasonably written into the Constitution in such a way as to bring the people into the heart of government in ways which were impossible to imagine except in the smallest countries 20 or 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago. And this, I think, is something that we need to look at very, very closely. But I want to put on the agenda consultation around the national budget is something which is eminently reasonable and something that we should consider very carefully. I have to recognize Norman here and the work which was done in the People's Plan in 1977, which has not been sufficiently understood. Tremendous work which the team that he assembled to try to avoid going to the island, which eventually was not successful, but which the work for which is quite remarkable in sampling the Jamaican people and what their desires for an economic future might look like. 4, firmer institutional checks on corruption. Ironically, one of the areas in which Jamaica has made tremendous advances on the sly, almost, through the existing institutions, is in the area of establishing institutions to check corruption, the most important of which is the Electoral Commission. I think Jamaica's Electoral Commission is a model of probity now in how to run elections. It is bipartisan, also with independent members. it has functioned effectively in the last 2 elections, which have been remarkably peaceful given Jamaica's history, and which I think is for us at any rate, and perhaps for other parts of the Caribbean region, a model as to how these things should go. The Office of the Contractor General, which is a new institution established in the last couple of years, and people like Legacies will have to look at this, because there's still questions about how it operates, depending on, there was one leader who was like a czar, and he left. Now the question is whether the new leader will be able to have the same effect as the past leader. But certainly, much of the institutional basis for a serious attempt to address contracts is in place. INDECOM, which is the Independent Commission examining police behavior, which is a critical institution in Jamaica because of our history of police abuse of their power. The Office of the Utility Regulations, and there are a number of institutions which are right there in the main formal institutional space, which have not arisen by chance, but have arisen because of the growth of civil society, and it's constantly hitting at these weaknesses in the system over the past couple of years. So there are things that are there, and not everything is coming from some imagined future. But the question is how to concretize these things and allow them to function properly. And the almost complete legislation on financing in Jamaican elections, which, while questionable in the extent to which it is willing to go, can be seen as the beginning of a debate on a more thoroughgoing proposal later on. The critical factor here is the growth of civil society and its increasing voice in the old media as well as the new. And this is evident in the continuing sparring over the Chinese goat island shipping proposal, which I mentioned to you earlier on. There's a final and very important idea to undermine corruption. And this is, again, I quote my Carl Stone's, the late Carl Stone's, constituency council. I suggest to you that this idea is one that I put to you to consider very carefully. That is to say, Stone proposed that in order to undermine corruption, this constituency council, which would be a body drawn from all civic community and citizens' bodies, would sit with the Member of Parliament and decide on the management of the constituency. The mind boggles at the possibilities if this works properly, because what it does is take the distribution of contract work, etc., at the constituency level, out of the hands entirely of the Member of Parliament. I want to add my rider to Stone in that the losing Member of Parliament should sit on the constituency council, or the losing candidate should sit on the constituency council along with civil society. What it will do is, first of all, release the Member of Parliament from his absolute responsibility to run the constituency. He could then concentrate on his main function, which is to represent the people in the House, but he would also have an eye on the constituency because he wants to get re-elected. So, depending on how well the constituency is run, the sitting Member of Parliament will benefit, but the opposition or oppositions who would sit on the council as well would have their voice and would also benefit from the success of the constituency. This, I think, is an idea which has been lost in the debate and which we need to revive urgently, because it feeds off in so many different directions. The constituency council would also provide a two-way facility, giving people at the community level greater access to information coming from the center and access to the political space, making political decisions as to whom to elect based more on genuine information of the MP's performance and less on caricatures advanced from the opposition parties or from the various parties in their electioneering propaganda. Gender balancing. I am in favor of, Cynthia, a short-term quota system, which is to say a quota system for a given period of time during which its value is assessed. You mentioned the case of Frelimo in Mozambique, where over a period of time there was a quota, and then women were more involved in politics. I would suggest that a quota would be part of a review process, which if it led to an increasing possibility, set the precedent for women being involved more, then the quota could be withdrawn, and then the notion that there's some sort of permanent quota would be avoided. I'm open to discussion on that, but I think that would be one way to undermine the typical male argument that no quotas, a temporary quota. It's perhaps a tactical thing, but the foundation in it is that you're trying to build a precedent. And if the precedent works, then there's no need for quotas. How to get there? Back in 2000, I proposed a constituent assembly of the Jamaican people at home and abroad as an important mechanism to bring together the various dimensions of the nation in a conversation that could not only think through the mechanical dimensions of a new constitution, but the terms of reference of a Jamaican project. The practical feasibility of that is now even more evident in the burgeoning of smartphones, as I mentioned before, in the Jamaican and Caribbean landscape, to the point where there is now a saturation with more phones than users in circulation. There is also the very interesting development of crowdsourcing and its use in the recent Icelandic constitutional enterprise. I've read debates about crowdsourcing as a means of writing the Icelandic constitution, and there are pros and cons, but certainly it is something we need to throw ourselves up to. Iceland is a country with a population of less than 400,000 people, which certainly its scale, if not its weather, resembles the Caribbean. And therefore, the crowdsourcing of the Icelandic constitution is something I suggest that colleagues who have not looked on it carefully, Google it immediately after this, and engage in and look at what was done in Iceland. It suggests an entirely new approach and direction for democratic consultation appropriate to a wireless generation. The Constituent Assembly of the Jamaican people at home and abroad would not be a one-off event, but would rather reassemble perhaps every decade to address questions of change, such as, for example, whether we want to continue with a quota, a gender quota, as well as to allow a new generation to speak and to enter into the social contract. It could thus be considered as an entirely new constitutional feature, certainly revisiting and rewriting the Constitution as we move along. So some of the systems for change are in place, and in the case of Iceland, have been tested internationally. The problem is that the entrenched political apparatus has no taste for radical reform. So is the answer simply permanent impasse, or more likely terminal decay? No one is quite likely right that without a collapse or a severe crisis, you can have different levels of severe crisis. I mean, a severe crisis could be bankruptcy, it could just be the failure of an IMF test, one bridge too far, leading to further draconian measures that the Jamaican people are no longer willing to bear. Then without such a moment, there is no desire or taste for radical reform among complacent elites. I enjoyed Paul Sutton's graphic question, would Turkey vote for Christmas? I suggest therefore that at one level, our job as students of the Caribbean is to lay out a vision for alternative futures in as clear a way as we can, so that in anticipation of such a shock, we can provide possible avenues and pathways out of it for a better and more democratic future for the people of Jamaica and the Caribbean. As a coda and epilogue, I return to my question as to whether there is still a Jamaican project, with the simple answer of yes, there is. It is to be seen, to go back to my sporting metaphors, in the brilliant success of Jamaican athletes like Usain Bolt and Shelley-Ann Fraser in the Olympics and Athletics World Championships. Undoubtedly, these are individual achievements of glory, and nothing should be taken away from the individuals. Yet simultaneously, they are intricately woven tapestries of Jamaican organization, tradition, will, audacity, and perhaps surprisingly, democracy. organization in the deeply entrenched system of school sports programs from primary onto the grade secondary and now tertiary levels. We have these two systems. One is an academic system that fails, and one is an athletic system that is a world success. And this is an irony that we face. Both operating in the same school. Tradition in the existence of a pantheon of success reaching back to London and Helsinki, Manly the Elder, Wint, McKinley, Quarry, and down to the present triumphant successors. Will and audacity in the sheer unlikelihood that a young man from Coxey, near Sherwood Content, on the border of the cockpit country, should rise to beat the world, or a girl from Waterhouse, in many respects, one of the most notorious of the violent inner city communities of Kingston, could do the same, and both with qualities of grace. And democracy, in that athletics is one of the few avenues in which talented young people from any background, but particularly from humble backgrounds, can be first identified, second, nourished, and third, given the opportunities to fulfill their potential on the national and world stage without the weight of the suffocating class system frustrating them at every turn. Athletics is therefore a useful metaphor of what is possible in Jamaica if we can find the wherewithal to apply its methods to the political system, a system which in its turn was an avenue for progress, but over time has become its opposite, an albatross on the back of the Jamaican people, stifling their true potential. Thank you.
Using the prerogative of chair, the question that you quoted at the end that Paul had posed, would turkeys vote for Christmas? Clearly, they won't. But people do vote for turkeys and ham. And how do we get people to vote for change as opposed to turkeys or ham? Could be also one of the questions that we need to address. We have about 10 minutes, Kate, for some questions or more.
More, yeah.
Okay, and so let's have some questions for Brian, and then Kate will end and by giving you an idea of where we go next with this project towards the Jamaica Conference. Norman.
Thank you. So, Brian, I agree with all of your proposals, with some caveats, of course. Of course, we can talk about those later. But I have one observation and perhaps 3 questions. The observation is that you spoke almost entirely about Jamaica. Mm-hmm. So the non-Jamaicans in this audience might perhaps be forgiven for believing that what you have done is like most Mona-based social science, guilty of generalizing from the Jamaican case.
Yep.
Something to think about. The questions, first of all, what do you think, if anything, of the progressive agenda, which was the basis of the PNP campaign in whenever it was 2011? You don't need to spend too much time on it if you don't want to. I mean, you probably, you know. The second is the question of how do you get the turkeys to vote for Christmas? And the question here is, are there any lessons to be learned from those much more modest concessions which the political class has been either forced or cajoled to make with respect to their monopoly over the mechanisms, the political mechanisms? For example, you mentioned the Electoral Commission and the establishment of an independent. So what were the pressures which led to them agreeing to this? And are there lessons to be learned? Similarly, the establishment of the public ombudsman, the office of the Contractor General, and the coalition of civil society, which was established at the height of the Julius Affairs. So although these are relatively much more modest concessions, do they offer any kind of lessons with regard to circumstances which lead to the surrender of some power? And third question, is there any role at all for the regional dimension in your vision?
Well, yeah.
Should I start? Okay, I can. and we can go on. Okay.
Yeah, well, why don't you take that one and then we'll
yeah.
see how.
Norman, first of all, yes, I should have offered my apologies for focusing on the Jamaican case. I felt it was too. Colleagues who know me will know that I have a deep interest in Caribbean-wide politics. But precisely because of that, I thought that in sketching futures, I did not want to stretch my imagination to points at which it might burst. Looking at situations with which I have not been studying carefully enough over the past months and perhaps a couple of years. Deeply interested in the quagmire of Guyana. I have a special interest in the Grenadian situation. I have a family interest in the Trinidadian situation. And more than passing interest in the entire Caribbean. But I thought I'd focus on the Jamaican case and drill into it in order to present it as a case study in its own right, but not certainly in attempt to generalize, and I tried to say that to some extent on the whole of the Caribbean from it. Let me jump to your last point about the regional dimension, because it's our link, because what you're saying essentially is that a Jamaican nation has played out a Jamaican case, or hinting at it anyway. I thought the points you made yesterday were substantial ones. Is how do we address sovereignty in a more flexible way? That is to say, where are the areas where sovereignty doesn't work? I mean, the Eastern Caribbean countries learned this a long time ago with their bank. That for them, the bank is a pooling of sovereignty, and it has worked brilliantly. The Eastern Caribbean has the same exchange rate with the US dollar because of the nature of the banking arrangements as well, but nonetheless for the past 40 years. Jamaica, on the other hand, has gone in a different direction. So I'm entirely in favor of us going across the board and then examining these questions. So, in fact, I agree almost entirely with the points you made yesterday, how we approach it. Instead of approaching it from the common market trade dimension, which was a failure in the beginning and remains a failure to this day. Indeed, the areas we have made most progress regionally are in the areas of functional cooperation, as you well know. Disaster preparedness, the University of the West Indies, the CXC exam system. We could go down the list, and we need to pursue those across the gamut of potential issues. And where sovereignty is compromised, so be it, because we don't have sovereignty anyway. So I think that I'm certainly in agreement with you there. Your point about how each of these instances in which there have been breakthroughs needs to be developed as a project in its own right in trying to understand it. The Electoral Commission goes back to the 1970s when the PNP was faced with the likelihood of what it considered as subversion against itself as a government, the likelihood of there being peaceful elections in Jamaica. And I would suggest that leadership was critical in that one. In that one could argue that in an environment which was hostile, Michael Manley found the wherewithal to approach not Edward Seaga, but Hugh Shearer who was the second leader of the Jamaican Labour Party. And they sat down and fleshed out the possibility of an electoral commission which had both parties in it. And so the ability of far-sighted leaders to actually step above the fray of partisan politics was critical in a particular environment in that case. I think some of the more recent instances have been instances of popular coalitions. I consider Golding's resignation to be an instance of a popular coalition which never hit the streets. It was felt through Facebook, Twitter, the main newspapers, call programs over and over again, calling, attacking Golding's, linking with the garrisons and so on, leading to the point where it was evident that he had lost credibility, and stepping down was the only alternative. That I think is a different kind of popular alliance, which is perhaps new to Jamaica, where the traditional move was to hit the streets and to roadblock the place from one end of the island to the next. So what we're seeing is the emergence of new kinds of alliances, but interestingly involving trans-class alliances, because this one involved both working people who are simply fed up with the violence, which affected them more than anybody else anyway, and business people and middle class people, etc. And the breadth of that alliance, including right into his own party, forced him ultimately to resign. So I think this is a very important point, and one that requires deeper examination. The possibility of building coalitions is there. And so therefore, if I seem to be arriving at a dead end and waiting for the, as we would say in Jamaica, the outer claps, right? That perhaps is false. That in fact there are ways that we can move to outmaneuver power.
We have several hands up. I'll take two sets of questions, three each, and there's first Matthew, Peter, and Paul, and then we'll go to Clifford for the second round.
Matthew, Peter, Paul. There is a look here.
And his last name is Bishop.
Alright, rewriting the gospel.
I wanted to ask you a bit more about this regional question, but I think Norman's done that. I think something that I found really interesting, Brian, is you're talking about creating ideas that don't necessarily have obvious value to powerful forces now, but may do at a certain period. And two things struck me about this. The first one is the fact that what is often not recognised enough about the neoliberal revolution is the fact that the ideas of the Chicago boys were seen to be very out there, madness really, right up until the late 70s, when after a period of crisis in the world economy, those ideas that they'd been preparing for a long time suddenly found a willing constituency in the IMF and Thatcher and Reagan, and they took them on. So I think there's something quite hopeful in that, in the sense that if you can create a new set of ideas, kind of Gramscian idea, you can create a new set of ideas that can then become hegemonic, you can do things in a different way. But the more pessimistic case that it made me think of is that Colin Hay, political scientist at Sheffield, wrote a fantastic paper a few years ago about the Anglo-liberal growth model called Pathology Without Crisis. And he took the Greek sense of the word crisis, meaning a period at which the old is kind of dying and the new is about to be born, and the crisis is the period at which the new starts to be born. And it struck me that if you take that definition of crisis, then what we see in the Caribbean is not really a crisis, it's just often almost purgatory. The crisis hasn't come yet in many respects if we're trying to transition to a new social political model. So that struck me as something quite pessimistic in the sense that the conclusion of Colin's analysis in relation to the global economy is that the problems we've got globally could endure easily for 10, 15, 50, 100 years. There's no reason why we necessarily have to transition to something better. And one of the reasons we haven't, to link to my first point, is the fact that there are no ideas that can become more hegemonic than the liberal ideas that seem to be so dominant at the moment. There are lots of ideas out there that people have, but none of them yet have the backing, enough powerful forces. So my question, in a long roundabout way, is what is the situation that we can perceive that might create a crisis, and how do we get the ideas that we want to create to become hegemonic?
Peter?
My question was a bit similar from a different point of view. Brian, you talked a lot about the initiatives coming out from the 1960s and 1970s. So I guess one question is, what would change to actually allow these ideas to come to fruition? And conversely, how would you judge the level of sort of political thought and new ideas within the region at the moment in terms of projecting a new kind of future?
Repeat the second question. I was thinking on the first one, I didn't hear the second
the level of new political thought and ideas within the region at this time, looking forward to a sort of new approach and way of doing things.
Paul?
Yes, the analysis you gave of Jamaica, linking into Norman's general analysis of the Caribbean, spells out a very stark picture for which the political model and Westminster may not at all be appropriate to resolve. Yet all your suggestions for change could easily be grafted onto a Westminster model. Indeed, it reminds me a little bit of Selwyn's book on Winner Takes All, where after having this massive expose of difficulties in the Caribbean, he comes up in the last 3 or 4 pages with very, can I say, modest proposals for change. Are your proposals not almost too modest, given the scale of the crisis? And the point I made in my presentation was that you talked about a constituent assembly for Jamaica. I think we have to go beyond that, going to the constituent assembly of all in the region to get the solutions to that problem.
Right. Okay. Well, this is a mouthful. A hand, whatever, it's full. Matthew, I like the idea of purgatory.
Yeah, that was probably too strong. I didn't mean to have it so.
But you know, we've been in this situation for a long time, and I think we need to have a historical perspective on it too. That what happened is that a generation lost its nerve, and certainly we can trace it back to particular events. 1980 in Jamaica, 1983 in Bermuda, the death of Rodney in 1980 in Ghana. What it did is that a generation lost its nerve, and you lose a generation's momentum, right? The half generation that came up after that generation is my generation, and most of the people from my generation decided to abandon the academy and to enter business school, right? And they've done very well. Or abandon the struggle and enter business school, to put it like a model again, starting.
Well, they left altogether.
Well,
they left altogether.
Well, they left altogether. And some of them went mad. Some of them actually went, I know it's not politically correct, but we're insane.
So what's on the rise of the women's movement?
No, I want to nuance it, and I agree with you completely. That is, it's not. I mean, there are people who have been down in the valley struggling all this time, but the momentum of a historical movement was broken. It was broken, and you simply don't, turn the corner on a dime and proceed as though life goes on as usual. You have a generation's gap, but that was compounded by the mass migration, and so what you have is the best of our people in terms of intellectual preparedness, in terms of skills, leaving. But they don't just only leave, but they leave their children behind who have no nurturing. So you have a generation without mothers. So we're in a peculiar situation which has set up factors which has led to this long dark night. Now, in that long dark night, there are forces at work. Now we mentioned women's movement. There are forces in the trade union movement who have never stopped working. But the momentum of a moment was lost. And this is what I'm looking at. So historically, that can be recovered, right? And I'm an optimist. But it may not be recovered for me to be a part of it, but it can be recovered. And therefore, I think that rather than just see it as a strobe light flash, and this is purgatory, no, it's a process, and that's how I live from day to day, because it's a process. And what kind of input can you make? Certainly, I can make an input at the level of ideas, and I think that's where just attempting to tease out and tweak out the next phase in this development, I think is very important. I want to link together your point about Gramscian ideas, etc., with Peter's point about new political thought in the region, and essentially to suggest that this I think is a more fertile moment than 10 years ago. And there are, if one thinks about, one has to look at little things. there's another debate, which is not for this room, as to how things moved from a political economy engagement with the world to a postmodernist engagement with the world and a post-structuralist engagement, and the implications that had for muting practical, ordinary struggle, like engaging with trade unions, engaging with women's movements, engaging with civil society, because I suspect that a generation of intellectuals were engaging with each other exclusively. And that has been part of the process. That is part of the escape from a more popular engagement. Which, but at the same time, I think we're emerging from that. I think there are some positive signs. If you look at Aaron Kamogisha's new collection, which tries to bring together and tries to catalog Caribbean thought, and the tenor of it, then we can see the possibilities of a new regrouping in a new generation. Every time I go to the Caribbean Studies Association, I see young people who are trying to find ways to become involved. One of the ironies is that some of the best of these young people don't live in the Caribbean. They know they're Caribbean people, but they live in New York, or which is another venue for Caribbean activity. Not so much in London, but in other parts of the United States and Canada. Paul, I both agree and disagree with you. I think that what one is trying to find is an approach that can connect with political reality, yet move it forward. You know, I could easily sit down and sketch a sort of movement for the assemblies of the people, framework, or for people's parliaments. But I think the political, where people are they are still in an electoral framework. And I think it is an extraordinarily important framework, because this is the result of people's victories. And this is the point I was making earlier on, which is really a slight disagreement with some of what Norman said, but also some of what I think you said, if that came out. But in a sense, the electoral system is not just an inheritance from Westminster, but it's a victory of the people. I think C.Y. Thomas was making this point years ago in his Rise of the Authoritarian State, but also in his critique of both his own party and the Caribbean left, that the democratic electoral system is a gain of the Caribbean people. And so therefore we have to take it and carry it in a direction which moves it away from its elitist moorings into a more popular space. And that is the sort of thought space that I'm engaged with, which you know, frankly, where I stand now, I would prefer to have Westminster with recall and with a popular budget debate and with constituency councils than I would prefer to have the presidential system. And maybe in a year's time I might tell you something else. but that's where I am. And I'm speaking now specifically about the Jamaican case, because this is why I don't want to necessarily tread on St. Lucian territory or Barbadian territory. I'd like to hear more from St. Lucians and Barbadians, or people working on those contexts as to how they see their specific situation. But I think the Jamaican situation, I fear gridlock, fear it, and some of the other features that come with the presidential system, even as it provides certain sorts of protections against a single section of government being involved. So that's sort of where I am.
We have one more set of questions, and then we'll close. It's Clifford in the back, and then here.
So let me start off by, Brian, by picking up on the sports metaphor that you started out. I think you started out as night watchman, but somewhere along the way, when you're discussing the presidential system, you talk about steering the ball into the goal. Which suggests more of, sort, or maybe your own dexterity as an athlete, right? But for me, I would sort of steer the ball between second slip and we got it down to third man or something like that. That aside, the question is this: given that you still see the national agenda going forward, and I would imagine you'd expand that and say for every country in the region that the national agenda is still alive and well. Do you think that this might be incompatible with the regional agenda, or do you see no contradiction there?
So I'm going to hold the question.
Yes, in the back, yes.
Brian, thanks for a well thought out closing. I'm in agreement with all of your conclusions. The one thing that I would just when you said any system that can smooth the powers of the Prime Minister, because we know that what that base is capable of. Again, I heard strange voices I hear of people like Dame Mary Eugenia and Baroness Thatcher in defense of their leadership style, claiming that you can do all the consultations you want, you can do all the parliamentary and cabinet debate you want, but in the final analysis, a decision has to be made. And someone has to take that decision, and it's me. So again, it comes back to that leadership style and the manner in which a Prime Minister is governing. Whether there's a danger in curtailing those powers, as necessary and obvious as it seemed to be, that we may lose something in the decision-making process in the small islands. The ability for a Prime Minister to act quickly, decisively, that we may just lose that. So there's something I thought I'd throw in for you to respond to. And the second thing you mentioned in terms of the Integrity in Public Office Commission, that in Jamaica this was working very well. You applaud it, and likewise I do, because our situation in Dominica is just paralysis. It's been politicized because the appointments are done through the political parties, so members go in there to defend their political position. Members from the opposition who are appointed attacks the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's side. It's like playing on Parliament on a minute scale. So I was interested in the makeup of your IPO, how the members get selected, nominated to maintain that integrity and independence that you talked about.
And finally,
sorry for my voice a little bit. Thanks very much for your presentation. I think the question I wanted to come back to is something about this rudderless times that we had, whether there's any value in revisiting federation, which is something I've discussed way back in the past, and which your country knows something about. And also to mention that in the case of Guyana, I think there's some very interesting things happening that you mentioned. You're keeping an eye on that situation. And I'd like to say that for some of the ideas that Walter Rodney fought for and consider some of the solutions in Guyana was about a government for national unity and reconstruction. And I think the present political situation is in some ways bringing Walter's ideas to the fore again, where the opposition is having much sway and the government is having, for instance, being forced to discuss the budget with the opposition before putting it to the people. And I wonder whether some of his ideas are still relevant for these times.
please, one more question.
Thank you, John. I'm asking this in the interest of gender balance only. And I know that you Caribbean academics like your sporting metaphors. Now, you've highlighted the Jamaican Olympic team as a model. And a couple of years ago, I heard Sir Hilary Beckles, and he highlighted the fact that the West Indies fielded the first multiracial cricket team and saw that as a model. But how do you translate these cricketing or sports models into political reality?
I'll try to be quick, if I can. Is it national compatible with the regional? We were having a discussion last time, my own sense is that the two have to work in tandem, but that if we don't solve the national agenda and some of the issues with democracy and accessibility within the countries, it's going to follow the regional plan. So it's not a succession thing, but it's one leading the other in the process, and it's dialectic. I mean, if you think about federation, to go back to federation. And the absolute failure on the part of the PNP in Jamaica to politicize federation and to carry it down to the grassroots in a way which would have won people to a project. Marking the project itself was tattered. So I mean, to convince people about what was being proposed was very hard in the first instance. But even so, to attempt to do that was never done. So it was a question of Manley versus Bustamante. And in the end, Bustamante was able to win that particular battle. So the question has to do with how we find ways to deepen democracy and accountability within our societies as we seek to find avenues to advance the national agenda. But I'm very clear, I mean, I'm a regionalist. My mother is from Trinidad. My wife is from Grenada. I have to be a regionalist, right? In the blood. But the way towards a regional unity has got to be, I think, via a deepening of democracy in the territories as we seek to find ways, as Norman suggested yesterday, to find avenues to a shared sovereignty. Federation, there was a survey which was done in Jamaica. My wife is a international relations person, and she was involved in that survey around 6 or 7 years ago, which asked the Jamaican people what kind of relationship they like with the Eastern Caribbean, and the majority said political union. This is the Jamaica which is supposed to be the bane of federation and the last country to want to come into anything with this. Having said that, I would suggest that one of the things we need to think about is a sequence of unity, because there's a natural sequence which is actually proceeding now, beginning with the OSS and then extending to Barbados and Trinidad, in which Jamaica too early in the sequence is always dangerous. And if I make any sense, no, but there are obvious reasons. You jump on a schooner and you're up and down from St. Lucia, Guadeloupe is part of that, as is Martinique. But Jamaica is out on a wing. Jamaica is really a Spanish island that was captured. So we're out on a different wing, we're in a different part of the Caribbean. We should really be looking first at Haiti and Cuba, right? And we are in some respects doing that as well, as is natural. And Belize, and these are all natural neighbors. But the Eastern Caribbean are visible to each other. And therefore, it is on the basis of Eastern Caribbean unity that Jamaica will see the light. And I'm putting this crudely, but that is a sequence which can work most effectively.
You don't stop traveling by schooner now, right?
Well, this is where I'm coming from. A federal boat. A federal boat used to come to Jamaica. I'm putting that crudely, but I think there's something there that we need to think about. What the Eastern Caribbean states are doing now is, I think, at the cutting edge. They're leading all of us. And we have to watch very carefully. And to the extent that more than watching, but helping is possible, but helping only fast. Right? We have to see that process as the cutting edge of a Caribbean unity. That will ultimately have to include the non-English speaking countries, but that's where the action is. And I think it's very positive. Can you remind me of your name?
Gerald.
Gerald, sorry. Gerald, the question of leadership style and the point I was trying to make was that in any program of development, you need both some kind of consensus, some kind of long-term planning, and some kind of firm leadership. And those are all the reasons why I had a problem with the presidential system. Because it can do that, but it can also lead to what is President Obama is facing today. And that isn't a danger. But more broadly on the question of leadership, I made a point about Michael Manley and Hugh Shearer working together to form the Electoral Commission in Jamaica. Leadership is critical. And leadership can make the difference. And I think this is why people like C.L.R. James were rooted in Marxist notions of class. But at the same time, James was much wiser than any crude Marxian notion of economic determinism, focused on, whether you agree or disagree with him, on the inner workings of Toussaint's mind, or inner workings of Dessalines, and why Toussaint was like he was, and Dessalines was like he was. And he made a psychological analysis of them. There's a big debate as to whether James was wrong or right, but the point is that leadership in this entire process is extraordinarily important. And if you want to think about the classic example, Rodney was a man who said that he was just an ordinary member of the WPA, like anybody else, right? But when Rodney was killed, the momentum of the WPA was completely slowed down, almost to nothing. That is the nature of the nation. And we could use so many other examples. I'm not sure which of the commissions you're speaking about in Jamaica, but the one that I've been using mostly as a model is the Electoral Commission. And the Electoral Commission is composed of PNP, JLP, independent people, right? They work together, they work effectively, they arrive at a consensus. The boundaries are drawn not as a result of the whim of any particular party. So gerrymandering has been largely removed. Changes have broad appeal. Elections in the last 2 elections, this is very important for Jamaica because we've had elections, 800 people have died. 1980. We've had almost no casualties. And elections finish at 6 o'clock, and by 7:30, in a country of 2.7 million people, all the results are known, and everybody accepts it, and we move on to the next stage. But this is a remarkable turnaround, right? And one of the great success stories of Jamaica in this period. And that comes from a formula which has managed to get parties to work together and to work with civil society people. Finally, government of national unity and reconstruction. I forgot that last point. Oh, no. Okay, let me go on to the sports model. I think the point I was making was, first of all, it's an analogy, and therefore has to understand that thing. But I think we need to study institutional success. And I don't think you need to argue that our institutional success in cricket up to the 1980s, or institutional success in track, the Jamaican model, but there are also other Caribbean models too. It's not just Jamaica. We need to dig into it and understand that this is not just by chance or by skill, but it's an institutional question with deep roots. 50, 60 years of testing until it suddenly flowers. We need to learn from those things because that is where we're going to go in the next. If we don't learn from it, then we have to learn from the failures, and the failures are pretty. There are a lot of it. There was a rudderless times argument, but I've forgotten what that was.
That was part of my question, and you partly answered some of it with the Federation.
Right.
But I think with the government of national unity and reconstruction and so on, what is happening
in Ghana? I prefer not to comment on it. I'm watching it very carefully myself, but I don't feel sufficiently up to date on the cut and thrust to intervene in a sensible way. But I think there's some positive things. But I hear, Ghana. We'll have to talk about Ghana.
Okay. Maybe I can say something.
Yes, sure. Please.
I think I supported the Working People's Alliance and workers and so on. And so, for me, I see some very positive things happening in the sense that the opposition, who are not, the ruling party, were able to question and challenge the government on, for instance, the budget, and forcing them to actually make changes in the budget. There's more of a pressure on them about accountability, how you awarded contracts and so on. And there's more pressure being put on the government to be accountable, and there's even some questions about recall of Parliament, because they're challenged with some ministers in government whether they should speak or be able to speak in some instances and so on. So,
I think certainly we need to look at Guyana in the next conference as a country that has some differences in how parliamentary democracy has played out. Brian, thank you very much.